Dr. Sandra Tombe. Great to
Thank
see
you
you
for
in this
having me.
context. So I want to formally start and welcome you all to this edition of Methods Monday here at the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm Susan Allen. I'm one of the faculty here and one of several on a team that is making the Methods Mondays happen periodically here. We focus on methods in peace and conflict resolution, how we do research, how we know things about what works in conflict resolution. And really, it's a pleasure today to welcome Dr. Sandra Tombe, who is, we're very proud that she is one of our graduates from our PhD program. I really enjoyed co-teaching research methods with Dr. Tombe when she was doing her PhD here. And really excited for this opportunity to hear about your research methods that you've employed. And we're recording this session so we can share it with lots of other conflict resolution students and learn from more from you. So thank you so much for joining us, Sandra. If we could pause around 12:30 or so to allow questions and answers, but we'll turn it over to you for your presentation now. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Susan, for having me, and thanks to everyone. I see a couple of familiar names, so excited to be among, new and old colleagues. So thank you all for joining. I do have a presentation. Will I be able to share it? All right. So
yes, I think so. I made you a co-host, so you should be able to share.
All right, great. Well, thank you all so much for allowing me to share with you. Sorry, just a second here. All right, for allowing me to share with you my passion for research methods. As Susan mentioned, I had the opportunity to teach research methods with her and to teach, for about 1.5 years before moving to this new role I'm in. So I'm excited to get to talk to you today about network theory and network methods and how I'm using it for this particular project that I actually started while at the Carter School. So it's something that I still would like to get published at some point, but it's still here. So I'd be grateful for feedback or thoughts after the presentation. Let's see. So this particular project draws on network theory and network methods, which is an approach to studying complex and intricate problems to help us unpack them a bit and try to understand what are the dynamics and what are the different elements that go into informing these questions that we're interested in. I think once you hear of network theory and methods, it seems very, very intuitive that it makes sense for us as people who are interested in understanding conflict and studying it to draw on a method that has these particular assumptions. So network theory's main assumption is that there's interdependence in the problems that we study. So all of the issues that we're interested in are not independent from other issues that are related to them. So conflict, you could think of it as, if we take the example of gender-based conflict, for example, a lot of this might have relationships with lack of access to resources or lack of access to information. It may have a relationship to do with the environment we're in, right? So these problems are typically not isolated. And especially if you're coming from a quantitative perspective, there's that assumption that things are independent. And in reality, it is really not independent because there's a lot of things that go into creating a problem and therefore into solving it. Then the other key assumption of network theory is that interdependence affects behavior. If you think about it in terms of who are the people who influence you and the decisions that you make, yes, you're an independent agent, but your decisions are not typically formed in void, right? There's always input from others, from friends and family, and those are people who shape our political behavior, shape our political decisions, and shape how we might respond to conflict, right? And so these assumptions are what makes network theory an interesting methodology for us to explore as conflict, as people who are interested in it, understanding conflict and resolving it. So this particular project draws on research on network theory, and it asks the question of what accounts for the ties that we observe in this particular network that I'll be sharing with you today. It's a network of countries through which South Sudanese diasporas have migrated. So my interest in my dissertation looked at the transnational mobilization of diaspora communities by non-state actors. And so I used some of the data I've collected to be able to tease out some of these questions using network theory and methods. And so for this particular network that will focus on the nodes or the actors in this particular network are the countries. So I'm looking at the countries through which South Sudanese diasporas have moved over the last few years before coming to the US. And then the edges between them is the shared diaspora journey. So whether or not there's a tie between the countries that individuals have traveled from. So if you've left from South Sudan, for example, what countries did you go to, and did you move back from that country to another country? So looking at the edges and the ties that connect the two. And then I theorized that the links between these countries facilitates the flow of information, it facilitates the flow of people, the flow of resources. And so if I moved from, say, South Sudan to Cairo, most likely my network will know that that's a pattern that's been established. And if someone were planning to move, then they may use that link because of that established function that, or established relationship that as someone who's moved, I've already shown that, right? I've created that as an option for people. And so the hypothesis that I try to investigate using this method is that countries that share geographic proximity are more likely to have tangible and intangible flow of resources between them. So not just flow of people, but flow of information, flow of resources, as I noted. And I draw on some of these scholars that some of you may be familiar with who look at the role of intermesticity, which is basically having relational, cultural, or ethnic ties across borders and how that may facilitate movement. Others look like Salehan looks at the role of borders and how it changes the agency of diaspora communities to be able to play a role in their countries of origin. So I'm interested in all of these dynamics and how they play out and how network theory could help tease out some of these. So the key variables that I look at here are all network variables, right? So you could have your independent variables, which my data gets to, but outside of this particular presentation. But the key independent variables I'm looking at, which are independent variables derived from the network, look at the node. So in this particular context, the countries, right, as I noted earlier, and the distance of these countries out from the country of origin, which at the time would have been Sudan, actually not South Sudan, for those of you who know that South Sudan separated in 2011. Then I look at the edge between these nodes, which is the relationship, the link between them, and whether or not people are more likely to move back and forth between these different countries from once they've left South Sudan. Are they likely to go to Nairobi, for example, and come back to Juba, or do they continue on to other places? And so looking at that link and whether or not it improves the relationship between those countries. And then the key dyadic variable I look at is whether or not countries share border with Sudan. And so are ties stronger between, say, Sudan, it was one country, right? Because at the time, Kenya and Uganda, for example, shared borders. So an example of this would be, are the ties between Sudan and Uganda stronger than ties between Sudan and, say, I think one of my participants traveled to India. So you'll see the map that I have here as well. And so is proximity a factor in whether or not we have strong ties between these countries? So the data that I use for this analysis, as you can see, is data that I collected from Omaha, Nebraska, which, for those who are interested, it's a state with the highest number of South Sudanese people from a specific tribe within South Sudan, but it's quite it's fascinating when you think of Nebraska. Why Nebraska of all places? But this is where I collected this data in 2018. So this was kind of a pilot data to think about how I was going to design my dissertation. And all of those were South Sudanese people who migrated to the US over the last 25 years. I collected data from 103 participants, and the total that I used for this analysis is 99 surveys, 99 responses. So this is a map that shows you, since countries are my node of interest, right? So I'm looking at the connection and the ties between these countries, that South Sudanese people or Sudanese people at the time. I need to be consistent because it's a bit trippy, but I'll go with the map. So it's Sudan, so Sudanese people having left Sudan and the countries that they traveled to before coming to the US. So all of these are patterns of movement before arriving to the United States. And you can see the red nodes are my countries, and then the links between them are the ties or movement between them from one country to the other. And the thickness of these lines show just how highly trafficked, for example, Sudan and Egypt is, Sudan and Ethiopia are. So those are links that show you the density of that connection between those two countries. So then just kind of providing a descriptive statistics of some of these key variables that I'm looking at. So the edges or the links between those two countries, you see I have about, so the network size is 24. So that means I have 24 countries in the network that I just showed you. And then the edges, which is the connection between them, I have about 32 connections between all of these 24 countries. And so that explains why some are thicker, because there is more flow between them compared to others. And the dyads looks at links between each two actors, and I have 555 of those. And the network density, it shows you how dense your network is. And as you can see, my network is pretty small. And if I had more edges connecting some of these countries, my density would have increased. But my density is a function of the network size, and it's a function of the edges that exist within them. And then the geodesic distance shows me the smallest distance between each two nodes. So the closest nodes are about 1.9 distances apart from each other, which kind of shows you a measure of proximity within those nodes. And this is just a graph that shows you kind of the spread of this data. Then we go into the ERGM model. I forget now what ERGM stands for, but it's kind of a regression. If you've done any kind of regression, it's regression, but accounting for interdependence between your variables. So this is the main kind of analysis you would do when you're looking at it's kind of logistic regression, right? Looking at whether or not there is a tie that exists between those countries. So whether it exists, 2 is 1, whether it doesn't is 0, right? And ERGM helps you assess that. And it's a model you use because you're assuming interdependence, which is unlike all the other quantitative methods that you might apply, where you're assuming independence of your observations. Here, we're assuming that they're dependent, and therefore ERGM would be the model that you would apply. And so you'd notice that there are some results here that are not significant. For example, if we look at the first model, which basically says, given the edges that we have, what is the likelihood that there is a strong relationship between them? And you see here that my result is negative, and this is really a function of the size of my network, and then the level of density that we have, which is a very small level of density. We see this number increasingly improves as the model becomes a bit better. And by that, I mean moving from model 1 to model 4, that negative number decreases, right? But it's still in the negative, so it doesn't become positive. And then if we look at mutuality, right, which is whether or not people leave one country, go say from Sudan to Egypt, and then come back, we see that that's actually pretty positive in model 2. So then mutuality between those countries, which again is another way for us to think about the relationship between these countries, mutuality is relatively high and strong. And in model 2 in particular, it's significant. So the star typically tells you that this relationship is significant. Then interestingly here, we see that shared borders with Sudan. It's positive, but it's not statistically significant. So it tells you that it's not necessarily a thing to be thrown out, right? Because borders is important. It's what makes things, it's what makes movement easier and less of a burden for people. But the model shows it here as not significant. And it could be a function of needing more data, right? Because I'm working with only 99 respondents. And once you transform that data into countries, right, you have significantly less. So that explains why I go from 99 surveys to having only 24 actual observations that I'm studying, because my unit of analysis here is my countries and not the individual respondents of the survey, if that makes sense. And then we'll look at distance from Sudan, which is interesting that it is a positive relationship. It's a small number, but it is a positive relationship that shows there is an increased tie and stronger relationship between those countries and the network. And then there's a couple of other variables that I still would like to tease out. And, as I think about this project further, I could expand more. I could examine, for example, whether or not these countries are in East Africa or in other regions, and in Europe in particular. You see, I think I have a couple of those countries as well. So, so there's still really room to be done here, and I think the more I could polish this data, the more I can tease out some of these variables and think of others as well to include here. But I wanted to highlight kind of the key network variables here and how you might think about their applicability to your case. I could say more about this, but I'll come back to it after the full presentation. So this next slide, and I think the one after it, shows you the goodness of fit model. Basically so I did this analysis through R, and basically what R does is that to test the model that you've designed, the model that I just ran, which is I ran 4 models, right? Models 1 to 4. It runs a number of simulations to be able to assess how good of a fit is your model for the data that you have, right? So to what extent does the data answer the research question? And so you can see here that the dot here, if we're looking at model 1, the dot here shows that my model 1 is just slightly above the mean of the simulated data that R uses to be able to gauge how good of a fit the study is, but it is still within the range of the simulations that it ran. It's the same as well for models, for model 2. And we see quite a bit of a variation here. The most extreme, I would say, is model 3 here in the number of simulations that it's ran. You see kind of the mean of my model is a bit higher than that of the simulations, but it's still within the bracket that is within the margins of error that are allotted for this particular analysis. The goodness of fit test, as I noted, just helps you assess whether or not your data is a good fit for the kind of analysis you just ran. And the more you add to the data, the finer your analysis becomes, the finer this goodness of fit test becomes. And so this is an area where R tries to draw on not just your data, but running multiple simulations in the hundreds, if not even in the thousands of the model that you're in, to be able to gauge how good of a fit it is. So basically kind of playing with these different variables to assess whether or not your model is the best fit for this particular question. Then to conclude, this study, as I noted, is ongoing. I remember first presenting this at PolNet, which is the Political Networks Conference, while I was at Mason. And so I still have a lot of work that I need to do here. One of my areas of interest is to look really at proximity and what role proximity plays in not just the relationships that countries may have between themselves, but also we could transform this into looking at the network of individuals who actually move between those countries, and what role does proximity play in the ties that they have, right? Because I know here, for example, I have data as to where these participants live. I have data of their pattern of movement until they arrive to the US, right? So there are multiple layers that you can bring into how you understand this particular relationship. So one of the limitations for this particular work is that time is not accounted for. The way it's presented, it seems very static, right? Whereas if whether or not you move earlier in the year, depending on the season you move in, that could affect where you move, right? Whether there is environmental considerations for you as to whether or not going to Uganda is safer compared to going to Egypt, right? All of those dimensions and time of when people move, I think is an important category here that's not captured. And I unfortunately do not really have this information from the data that I collected. So other than how long people have lived in the United States, I don't have a sense of when they lived, how long they lived in those countries before coming to the US, and when in particular they moved to those countries. I think those are important parts that could be limitations for this work. Whether or not I could find a proxy for that is an open question, unless I don't have, of course, a way of contacting these participants. But I think maybe redoing this work and trying to gauge, trying to ask for those particular details would be helpful to kind of just shed further light on this particular network. And then the other dimension, which as you notice me flipping between Sudan and South Sudan, that the regional change from South Sudan now becoming part of East Africa, that's theoretically and practically important for how we're asking this question. So most of the individuals who've surveyed are people who are of South Sudanese origin, but by history and context, right? We were all from Sudan at the time of the moving, and so there's the challenge of whether or not we're assessing South Sudanese participants or assessing Sudanese participants, and that coding of Sudan as to whether or not it's part of North Africa or East Africa becomes an interesting dimension here. Before I turn it over to questions, I just want to highlight something about network theory and methods, and it relates to my point earlier about how I came to the 24 countries. So this particular survey was not collected as a network survey, unlike, for example, the data that I collected for my dissertation. In my dissertation survey, I actually designed network-related questions asking people to identify people with whom they speak the most, people with whom you socialize, community spaces where you go to worship, I would identify 5 people who go to the same church as you, who work with you, right? Actually collecting information that helps me identify the network of a participant. So that's typically when you're doing a network survey, that's really what you're doing. You're trying to assess the ties that an individual, whether it's a person, whether it's an organization, whether it's a country, you're trying to assess the ties that it has socially, politically, culturally. This particular survey was not collected in that way. It was collected as your typical survey. However, you could still create network questions out of survey that you collect that are not network survey. And so the way I did this is, of course, I asked participants, the countries they've been to before coming to the US, right? And then participants who've been to the same country have established them as individuals who are having ties. And so basically, you could think of this as the way I arrived at these countries is I established what countries participants have been to. I identified those countries, and then I created a network of the countries they've been a part of, or they've been in before coming to the United States, right? You could easily have established a network of individuals, right? Although these are, I'm responding individually to a survey. You could also create a network of individuals based on the countries that they've been to, right? So I'm creating a network. I've showed you here a network of countries based on the people who've been to these countries. You could also easily create a network of individuals who've been to these countries, right? Establishing what are the ties, and ask questions around whether or not people who've lived in Uganda are more likely to live in the same state here in the United States, right? And so that could help you gauge some social ties and social relations by conceptualizing a network differently. There are, of course, a number of other questions, right? Not just in my project, but if this is relevant for the work that you're doing, you're interested in some of these questions, there's a number of ways to think about network theory and methods and to integrate it in your work without necessarily having collected network data for that purpose. So with that, I'll stop here and turn it over to you for any questions, or if there's any slides that you would like me to go back to and clarify.
Thank you so much. Let's see if others have questions. I know I have several, but I'll also pause and see if anyone else wants to use the raise your hand function. And not seeing any immediate question there, let me just turn to what you concluded with there about other ways to engage network analysis, network theory to help us in the conflict resolution field. And I guess I wanted to ask you a bit about, having done this research, and I understand you're looking towards the publication of it and looking at, next steps. What other projects do you envision longer term? I know you're at the U.S. Institute of Peace now, and you're doing research and evaluation work there. How has the network analysis influenced your approach to other research?
That's a really good question. So a lot of what I do at the Institute is supporting research design and methodology and research ethics. I would say network theory has been a part that I've been trying to advocate for at the Institute. We have a few projects around the Global Fragility Act, so some engagements around that, and a lot of partners are interested in doing stakeholder mapping, and I think network theory and methods it's just very well conducive to that, and so trying to think of ways to use network theory and methods to be able to show kind of what are the ties that particular stakeholders have, not just in the GFA context, but in other contexts where we work, right? I think if you're mapping peace builders, generally speaking, network methods allows you to understand who are part of these particular networks you're interested in, and then you could even assess, right, how strong are some of these ties that these stakeholders have, who's the most central within the network. So that's more analysis that I could also bring into this data. Who are the most central actors within a given network? So I think we can even improve how we do network, how we do stakeholder mapping by incorporating network theory and methods, just because it gives us that added advantage of thinking about centrality, thinking about connectedness within a network, and translating that into leverage. Who are the actors that we absolutely need to have in the room? At the same time, network theory also helps us identify who are the actors that are part of the network but are not well connected, right? And what is it that we're missing by having them kind of being at the periphery of the network, and have to ensure that they have the ties that are important for them to do what they're doing. So I think it's good in helping us identify who's central for the conversation and who's missing from any conversation that we're interested in.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. That's great. Billy Aguanda has a question in the chat. Billy, do you want to ask the question yourself?
Yes, thank you. I was just wondering whether there were countries that acted as transit hubs, and would you consider this kind of movement as part of the network? By asking this, I'm trying to understand what was the conceptualization of the concept network within this particular study. Does it entail having established strong connections, or is it just about, as long as you move to a different country and then transit from there, that forms part of the network that you will consider as in your study? Thank you.
No, thank you for that. So so as I noted, this project is still in development, and there's a lot of other areas that I could bring into it. So I assume by transit hubs, you mean within the data that I've collected. So for this particular data, and I think that's actually a reflection of the context beyond, like in reality, a lot of people move through, South Sudanese people in particular, move through Egypt, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia. As you may remember from the graph I showed, Ethiopia is one major hub for people to which people move from South Sudan, or from Sudan in particular. So I'm interested, yes, I think I have a broader conceptualization than what I presented here. The role of proximity in particular is important, as I noted. I'm interested not just in how this movement shapes relationships between those countries, but I'm also interested in how it actually translates into social networks that are created here in the US, right? So you have communities that, so the data collected, it's data of a very diverse set of communities within South Sudan. And so to be able to tie this pattern of movement to where communities end up settling here in the US I think is an important part of this project that I would like to, if I can, tie it to this particular work rather than have it be two separate endeavors. So to your question, individuals, would you consider this as part of a network? So the countries, yes. So all of these individuals, as I noted, have settled in the US now. So yes, if I could show. So right, so here we have individuals who've made it as far as Malta, the United Kingdom, Cuba before coming to the United States. So yes, all of these countries that you've transitioned from as part of my network. Again, it's interesting to see that you have Ghana, Libya, Chad here who are not even connected to Sudan. So then that suggests those are individuals who were born elsewhere and who have no direct tie to Sudan, right? But the idea is that, yes, the pattern you take to get to the US, that is still part that establishes that network for you, and that helps us assess the pattern of mobilization, which is another key part of the question that I'm interested in. I hope that answered your question, Billy.
Yes, thank you very much.
Any further questions? Oh, I see Claudine has her hand up. Please, Claudine.
Good morning. Hi, Sandra. It's been a while. I have two questions. The first one goes back to the methodology. I'm wondering, when you were thinking about the specific project, why did you decide on the network theory? Like, among all different methodologies, like what was attractive to this one? I hope that's English. I'm sorry, I'm tired. Anyway, and the second question, as someone who also look at diaspora, but use mostly phenomenological as a methodology, I was interested in why those secondary countries, like if the people you interviewed or the people you researched talked about the reasoning to go to, for example, India before coming to the US? Was that kind of the pattern that was created because of the different network, because of different people they were interacting with? Or were there other reasons they ended up going to a country like, as I said, India, or even like UK before ending here in the US? Thank you.
Thank you for these questions, Claudine. I'll start with your second one. So unfortunately, given that this survey was collected in the non-conventional way you would collect network theory data or network methods data, I did not have a chance to go in depth with participants to ask why these particular countries. I think that would be a follow-on for me for sure, to be able to get a better sense as to why these countries, right? Some of them, some of the data shows proximity plays a factor. Some places are easier to get to than others. But then, yes, to your question, there are some places that don't make sense. And so it would be interesting to hear why these particular places. I suspect that a number of these participants have also been students to some of these places. And so I suspect it was less so a matter of proximity and more so looking for educational opportunities that may send someone all the way to Cuba or the United Kingdom, for example. So looking at other factors for like the identities of participants, which I think is an interesting way to get to your question without necessarily having investigated it. Now that I'm saying this, I'm writing it down. How the identity of the individual who's moving at that particular point in time may affect what countries become an option and what do not. And so I think that's a really good question. And so in my follow on, and I think this is where I consider myself more of a mixed methods person. And I think to your question, Claudine, this is where being able to draw on a tool that's a bit more qualitative allows you to answer some of these questions in ways that a survey, whether or not it's, whether or not it's network survey or not, does not typically allow you. So I think being flexible as well with how we get the information that we need and being authentic to that, I think is a good thing to do. So why network theory and methods? I think the first time I was introduced to this, which was during when I first started at Mason, so maybe my second year or so, it made sense to me to think of. I think the assumption of independence is short-sighted because there's a lot of things that govern the decisions that we make, and even if we just look at a more individual level, really we're not as independent as we think we are. We're dependent on social systems, institutions, networks that help us do different things. And so I don't think we give that dependence enough credit. And so to me, and when we think about conflict and peace in particular, those are, giant questions and problems that we're trying to engage. And so to assume that they're independent and solving one dimension would help address everything, I think is misguided. And so to me, it made sense as a method to be able to apply it. I think, I may be biased, I think you could apply network theory and methods to everything, of course, but you also have to ask the right questions. And I think ultimately the questions you ask should decide what method is appropriate, not the other way around, right? I think looking at diaspora, looking at questions that have transnational dimensions in general, interdependence and dependence is fundamental to how these relationships work out. So it made intuitive sense to me.
So Sandra, if I could ask you then to think about like your own positionality and how that has been part of helping you connect with this research. Do you feel like, could someone who doesn't have a South Sudanese background do the research in the same way that you did it? Or was your own positionality part of helping you understand, what's important in the research question, what's important in this methodology?
Yes, that's a really good question. Yeah, I definitely think we all have different entry points into all the kind of questions that we ask. I think being South Sudanese made it a lot easier for me to collect this data. I don't think it's anything that I did. It's just the fact that people realize that I'm South Sudanese as well. It just opened up doors in ways that others may not have in this particular space, given this particular question, right? It just means you have different entry points than I do when it comes to this question. That being said, I think interestingly enough, so I did my dissertation work on South Sudan and Cameroon, right? So I had a comparative case, and it was, I think generally people were, hesitant to provide information, hesitant to participate in the research. Interestingly, I felt like it was easier for me to engage with Cameroonians than it was for me to engage with South Sudanese people. And I try to think about why that's the case, right? Because I'm like, well, my, being who I am was such, it was such an advantage for this particular data that I'm presenting here. But for my dissertation work, it was actually quite a hurdle. And I thought about it as perhaps a function of, for the Cameroon case, and the particular focus of this Cameroon project for me was looking at the Anglophone conflict in particular. And a ton of meetings I've been in, a lot of Cameroonians basically compared their vision for the Anglophone part of Cameroon to South Sudan as kind of like the future of what they want. And so perhaps in some ways, being South Sudanese, I don't know, gave me an advantage to be able to engage with them as someone who symbolized in some ways the future of what they saw the end of this conflict looking like. Whereas in the case of South Sudan, there's a lot of just uncertainty about what's happening in South Sudan, and people perhaps feeling judged by someone who's an insider as to the positions and the opinions that they have about the conflict. So maybe that closed some doors for me. So I think in different, depending on the question, being an insider or an outsider can be an advantage and a disadvantage. And I think being able to think through those and prepare for them before you engage in any research project, I think is helpful. Yeah.
Thank you. And now you've brought up the Cameroon case, and I wonder if you could speak broadly to having two cases and cross-case comparison, and how did that structure the knowledge you were able to create by having two cases? How did that change the research, and what kind of findings?
Yeah, so then that moves us to more my dissertation work. So I was really interested in looking at how opposition. So my project looked at how opposition groups mobilize diaspora communities to be able to kind of gain leverage against the state. So looking at two Cameroonian organizations and then two South Sudanese organizations. And I was really interested in comparing the nature of the networks. So looking at the density of these networks here in the diaspora, what is the kind of, what is the links between these that shape these networks, right? Is it the flow of information, the flow of resources, the flow of services between these networks? And for me, the networks were individuals, right? So those are individuals who supported the SPLM-IO, for example, or supported the National Salvation Front in the case of Sudan, or those who are organizations that supported the Federal Republic of Ambazonia under, so there are two particular leaders that I looked at. So looking at those two branches, and I was interested in comparing the density of these networks and the level of fragmentation. So the nice thing about network methods is you can actually test the level of fragmentation, the clusters that you see. For example, if you look at this map, Ghana, Libya, Chad, here you could consider this a cluster, whereas, so there's miscoding on my end here because you see Chad again here. You should not see Chad twice on the map. So where you see Malta, the United Kingdom, that could also be a cluster, right? And so you can do further tests to understand, are these clusters significant in the groupings that they have? And what does that tell me about the density of my network and the opportunities that exist? So it was very interesting for me to notice across all these four networks that I studied for my dissertation, the level of fragmentation that exists. Yes, these are individuals who, in filling out the survey, have identified that they support this organization and the level to which they support it, but you can still see that there is fragmentation along certain key variables around the flow of resources, which were the key dependent variables for me. The flow of resources, information, money, and services. Trying to remember now what were some of my key network findings there. Though there was a lot of fragmentation, I had a high response rate, I guess to the point I was making earlier. I had a higher response rate for my Cameroonian case than I did for my South Sudanese case. And so I had a slightly more dense network for Cameroon than I did for South Sudan. And so that was interesting to kind of be able to see these patterns and to try to kind of investigate them. Yeah.
Thank you. So I look at our audience, Sandra, and we have here several of our current doctoral students, some doctoral candidates at the Carter School. And I wonder if you have advice as people are thinking about the methodologies they will use and engage in their own dissertations. I see you've done, not only the dissertation work, but follow on related further projects. And now you have a position in doing research. So do you have advice for current doctoral students, current doctoral candidates, as they shape their own methodological expertise?
Yeah, so my key advice would be understand what your question is and investigate what's the best method to study it. I think for me, it was very helpful. I think I attended ICPSR in Michigan. PolNet, I think I've attended PolNet ever since I found out about it. So trying to understand what are these methods and how you apply them, I think it's helpful generally as a way for you to think about what literature you might draw on. I think it's been helpful for me to just understand these methods and be able to speak them comfortably. Because that helps you understand what sources, what resources are out there, and it ensures that you're able to have a rich literature to draw on. So that's aside, right? And then the main part is, of course, being able to think of what's the best approach, what's the best methodology for me to answer my question. It's typically not, perhaps it's not the one you're most comfortable with, perhaps it's not the one that you've used in the past. And so just being open to that, I think for these two reasons, I would highly recommend just exposure to these methods and try to attend these conferences. I think it's very very useful. So that would be it for me. I think it helps to just become a better consumer of the literature that exists, right? A more versatile consumer of that, but also someone who's able to navigate what methods are better for what questions. Because I assume your dissertation, yes, it's an important question, but it's not going to be the only question you'll ask, right? So you may ask others that may require a different methodology than the one you use. So I think being flexible and having a good baseline for what to draw on, I think is helpful.
Thank you. I wonder if anyone else has any comments or questions before we move towards concluding here. Well, and I will move towards concluding with just really sincere thanks to you, Sandra. Really a pleasure to reconnect, a pleasure to see how your research has developed. Oh, I see chat comments. Kyle is saying thank you. And I really look forward to seeing where you go next with this. Look forward to the publication. Please do share. And really grateful that you're part of the Methods Monday presentations that it's going to be posted online so people around the world can learn from your use of network theory in this research. And hopefully others will find innovative ways to engage building on the approach that you've shared. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all very much. And if you have any questions or any suggestions as well for this project, feel free to reach out.
Do you want to share how people can reach you? Is that something you want to be publicly available? You can put it in the chat, maybe your email address.
I can do that. I check my USIP. I have to say I check my USIP more often, but you have both, and I do check my GMU less frequently, but I still do so.
That's great. You still have a GMU account. That's awesome.
I do. I think I was the last generation that was, or the first generation that was allowed to keep their GMU email.
Awesome. That's great connection to stay with the university. Well, thank you for coming back as our distinguished alumna and sharing your methodological expertise. And please do stay in touch. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all. Take care. Bye.
Bye.